Alright, so let's dive a bit deeper into Orchard once we have seen all the super basic stuff. And well, what's a content management system about if not about managing content? So, as you may have guessed, we have a lot of features to manage content in Orchard. And we could also say that content is kind of in the center of Orchard. So a lot of things, even what you couldn't have guessed, is some content. So let's take a look at the content menu. And well, here we can see all the so-called content items. Basically, every piece of content in Orchard is called content item. So content item is the terminus technicus for those in Orchard, but it's kind of self-explanatory. We also have, well, a page. This is this Welcome to Orchard page, which you can see on the home page. Before looking at that, let's take a look at content definition as well. Here we can see two more notions that we really get to understand how Orchard works and how content management works in Orchard. We have content types and content parts. Basically, the fundamentals of Orchard are that we have content parts, which are pieces of functionality, and those content parts build up content types, like blogs or blog posts or even pages. Now, if we take a look at page, for example, we see this is a content type. We see that this content type is built of parts. And when we kind of instantiate this content type, when we create a new item of this page content type, that's when a content item is created. So the three notions again, we have content parts, the basic building blocks of content, and we have content types like a page, and we have content items that we can create also by the admin. So let's piece all of these together and let's take a look at a content item while also comparing this with the content type. So again, I will go back to the content menu, but opening it in a separate tab, so we have some space. Actually, I will open this in a new. I will open this in a new window. Okay, so now what we see here is side by side the content type of page, and on the right hand side I'm now opening the content item created from this content type. So again, what we have here on the blue on the left screen we have kind of the blueprint of how pages are built up, and on the right screen we have an actual instance, an actual content item of that page. So let's take a closer look. Under this page we see that we have a title specified. So I wonder what piece of functionality handles that. And if we take a look at the content type on the left hand side, under parts we see that there is a title part. So probably that's that. By adding the title part to the content, to the page content type, we added this piece of functionality that handles the title. This whole content type, content item, content parts concept makes the content model of Orchard quite flexible. So here nothing is static as far as content goes. You can change the building blocks, you can add new ones. So if I wanted to change how pages are built up, I can add a new part or a new field. You will see that in a moment what that is. For example, if you add some new data to users, we can also do that because users are also content items. So quite cool. But let's take some further look. We also have a permalink here, well, which will be the URL of the page, and that is handled by the outer route part. And if we click this little arrow here, we also see that parts can actually have configuration. So not just content types, but individual parts can be configured as well on the content type level. For example, what we see here, there's a lot of stuff to it. A lot of content parts have a lot of configuration options, so we won't go over each of these. But here's an example. You can see that we can configure so-called patterns, how the outer-out part will generate the URL, the permalink of the content item. And as you can see, the default one uses the title to do that. It actually uses the content.slug token. What tokens are, we will also cover later. But for now, the main point is that the outer-out will be generated by taking the title and making it URL compatible. As you can see, this is exactly what happened. So we have welcome to Orchard as the title, and this welcome-to-orchard as the permalink. And since we configured, or well, the default recipe configured the outer-out part to allow custom patterns, we could also change this if you like, but we don't want to. And by the way, well, this is the URL of the content item, but we have seen that this is actually the home page, and this is also indicated by this message. If this wouldn't be a home page, we would see a checkbox to make it a home page. And furthermore, to the bottom, we see the so-called layout editor. I will make this full screen in a second, but just to connect this again, we can see that this is handled by the layout part, content part. Now the layout editor is something quite recent. It was added in Orchard 1.9. It's quite a cool feature to build rich content pages. Well, the name is pretty much self-explanatory. You can build layouts with various pieces. So if you take a look at this, we can see that on this canvas we have various of elements. Well, we have some structuring elements, like first a grid, and inside that grid we have a row, and inside that grid we have a row and another row for these two sections. And inside the first row we have a column, and inside that we have an HTML element. So if you are familiar with HTML, this is a very similar structure. Well, obviously this will become HTML or will be rendered as HTML in the end, so no surprise. How we can build a similar structure is by using these elements on the right hand side from this toolbox. So here we have an HTML element with some piece of content, but if you would like to, we can also add something more. Like if you go to the home page, and we can go by clicking this the site name on the left top corner, by the way. If you go to the home page, we can see that well, there is some space between this section and this section, but how about adding an old school horizontal line? And there is an element for that. It's called break. So if you go back to the layout editor and drag this break element from the right hand toolbox, we can just put it somewhere. As you can see, if I move this element, there will be areas highlighted where I can drop this. Well, probably the best way would be to create a separate row for this, but for now I will just put it in the first row below the HTML element. And to say HTML element the 10th time today, now we can see that under this first HTML element we have the break element that I just added. And by the way, lower we have in that other row we have columns, and this time we have 3 columns for these 3 sections, which are again HTML elements. And by the way, we can also edit these, of course. So before saving this and seeing what happened, let's also edit this first HTML element. you can see that if I click this element, there will be a little toolbox displayed. I could also delete it or move it up and down like this to change place with the horizontal line. Or I can edit the properties of the HTML element, like its HTML ID or some CSS properties. And under this edit HTML content, I can open a VCVig editor. What you see is what you get editor, and actually edit the content. So if you are working with non-technical users, this is what they would use. They would probably not touch anything in a layout editor, but rather go to an element and edit its content. So what we can do here is, well, do anything that you can from such an HTML editor, just as usual. So let's add some text. This is Dojo Course 2. Let's also make this bold. Well, we have the whole toolbar for this here, and this will be enough for now. This is using TinyMCE, if you are familiar with it. Well, all the basic captions should be familiar from any VCVig editor or even from editors like Word, but there are a few special things. Well, there is an insert media button. We will see that also a bit later, so no spoiler yet. This is something Orchard specific. And there is also a full screen button, by the way, to make this, well, full screen if the editor is in an outer layer or just full window, like in this case. And by the way, there is also a source code display. So if you want to dig into HTML, you can do it like that. Otherwise, let's save this. And as you can see, well, obviously the layout editor here was also updated, so now we have welcome to Dojo Course written here as well. So let's save this content item. And let's scroll to the bottom a bit. Again, we have different sections here, so you might guess now that tags is also handled by some kind of content part. And you were absolutely right, because there is a text part. There is also some show on a menu checkbox here, which is handled by the menu part. We have a date picker for this created on date, which is kind of loading funnily at the moment. We will look into that. But here you could specify the creation date of the content item. And not surprisingly, this is also added by some content part, actually by the common part. And by the way, you can also change who the owner of the content item is, which should be a user, which is also handled by the common part. The owner, setting the owner is something useful for access control. We will look into user management and permissions also a bit later. Owners can have special permissions for content items. And finally, we can either save or publish now or publish later the content item. What are these? By default, or usually, content items in Orchard are versioned. That means that you can, if you change a content item, there will be a new version created. And you will be able to go back to the previous version, and you will be able to see what the changes were. And not just that, but also deletes in Orchard are commonly soft deletes. So if you remove a content item, it will be hidden, but it will be actually kept in the database. The reason for versioning and for soft deletes is that sometimes, for compliance reasons, for legal reasons, you will need to keep track of content changes. And not just for that, but if you have a large news site, for example, with many editors, you may want to see who changed what. And versioning and soft deletes also helps you do that. Not to mention, if somebody mistakenly deleted something, you will be able to restore it. And the save, publish now, and publish later buttons are also related to versioning. So if I click save now, then what will happen is that, well, the content will be saved, but it won't be published yet. So you can see your page has been saved, but if we go back to the content list, we see that there is a draft version. And if we go to the home page and hit refresh, we can see that actually nothing changed. So why is that? When I've hit save, a draft version was saved. The published version, but users can see, was left intact. So now we actually have two versions, the published version and the draft version. So if I would edit the content item, I would still edit that draft version. And we can actually go there, do some changes, hit save again, and still the published version would remain the same, but the draft would have changed. So we can do this as long as we want, and once we are satisfied with the content item, we can either publish it right now or schedule it to be published later. This latter feature is exactly what you would imagine. We can select a date, like tomorrow, hit publish later, and the system will automatically publish the content item at that time. This is useful if you want to schedule changes. So, for example, if you want a blog post to be visible at a given time, you can write the blog post in advance and then schedule it for later. But for now, we'll click Publish Now. But, well, let's not do that here, but let's go back to the content list again. And let's take a look at this menu. Because we have a handy toolbar here too, we can click View to, well, view the published version of the content item, which is the home page. Or we can publish the drafts from here as well. This is exactly the same as the Publish Now button under the Content Items editor. We also have Preview. This is cool because if we click Preview, we can see the version of the content item that we edited as a draft. You can see that here in the URL we also have version 2 appended, so that's also a telltale that there is some versioning in the background. And actually we have our changes like the string and the horizontal bar visible here. So it indeed was saved. We can also unpublish the content item. So we can actually turn a published content item into a draft. We can also clone it, which will, well, make a copy of the content item. We can edit, which is the same if we click here, so we just get to the editor, and, well, we can delete it, which again will be just a soft delete. We will also see how content items can be restored or destroyed later, completely destroyed later. For now, let's just click Publish Draft, and if we go back to the home page, we see now that it's actually the edited content item. Basically, every content item is editable like this. So, as mentioned, not just pages are content items. Blog posts are also content items. Comments under blog posts are also those. Pieces of media like images that you can upload are also content items. Users too. So if you take a look at the content definition admin again and check out users, or check out user, you see that it's also a content item. Okay. Well, a content type, and users created from that are content items. But now that we know the basics, let's take another look at the page content type, and let's dig a bit even deeper. You can see that we can also change the display name of the content type. This is the same which is displayed here. And we can set a few configuration options. Creatable means that users are able to create the content item from here. So if I remove the checkbox and save the content type, then we can't create it from here anymore. Now for pages we want them to actually be creatable, so I will leave this like that. But for certain content types you may only want to create them from code. Because, for example, you are creating them in a programmatic way from some background data store or by fetching data from some API, and then you don't want users to create those content items. Listable means that these content items will be listed under the content menu. Well, this is again not always useful. Draftable means that draft versions can be created. Even if versioning is in place, you can opt not to allow drafts. So every save will actually publish the content item. Still, a new version will be created, but the new version will be visible immediately. Securable means that the content type has some built-in access control. We will see that later. And by the way, placeable, well, this is some bridge between the old word of before having layouts and the new word of having layouts. And with this you can create content items that are placed into a layout, which is kind of useful sometimes. But there is some crucial thing we haven't touched yet, and this is called fields. Now, as mentioned, content types are built of content parts. So what are fields? Fields are actually not something completely new, but these are also kind of building blocks for content types. And fields can, although it will seem not like that from the admin, but fields can actually be added only to content parts. So if I click add field here, then while it seems that I'm adding a field to the content type page, actually there will be a content part created in the background and the field will be added to that. So again, we can still say that content types are built of content parts, just content fields can be also added to content parts. And what's a field? A field is also a piece of functionality like a content part, but most of the time it's a simpler one, and it's something that caters for storing a piece of data, as opposed to adding some more complex piece of functionality like a content part. And furthermore, with content parts you can only add one content part or one instance of a specific content part to a content type. With fields you can add as many as you wish. So for example, I can add a text field to the page content type, but I could also add many more text fields. I can't add another title part, however. So we have some built-in fields. Do check them out if you are interested. It's usable. All of them are usable in the same way. But these are all here to store various pieces of data, various kinds of data, like a Boolean value, true or false, or a reference to another content item in the content picker, or, well, a date time. Now let's take a look at one of the simplest ones, and that will be text field. This will allow us to, well, not very surprisingly, store some piece of text under the page. So let's add, for example, author. This is a simple example and probably not something you would do in production, but sometimes the person or the user receiving a content item is not the same who actually authored that. So probably it's a good, it's sometimes useful to add the author separately. And if we take a look at the newly added field, we can see that this is also configured as well, just as, for example, the author out part that we have seen. For example, we can use a so-called flavor for that. This is, well, in every case, a text field will store a piece of text, well, a string in programming terms. But here we can choose how it will be editable. Well, we can have a large text box or a small text box. We can have a text area. We can have an even larger text box, or we can have a vsvig editor for HTML here. Well, I will go with just large. We can also add some help text, like specify the author's name here. By the way, help text and whether it's required or not, we will leave it not required for now. And the default value are all common field functionality. So for every field you will see the same configurations. Not display option, this is just for text field. So let's save it now. And let's take a look at how our content type looks. By the way, I changed the creatable option, so I will change that back. So now we can again create a page. But let's go back to our original home page and take a look at that again. As you can see, now we have an author field here. And under that, the help text is also displayed, so everything works as it should. Well, the author in this case will be Lombiq, because my company won't allow me to use my real name. Just joking. No, it really won't. And here you can see that on the front end, we can actually see the content of that field, so it is properly displayed. Hooray, everything works. One final note for the content type editor. Let's go back here. Well, I will actually again open the content type editor on the left hand side. There is one more cool thing you can do for content types from the admin. There is this edit placement button. Placement is a wider term in Orchard, and it's also a developer term, so we will see how to change placement from code. But what it means is basically how pieces of content parts and content fields are displayed relative to each other. There is much more to that, but that's probably the basics. And what you can do a lot of stuff around that from code. What you can do from the admin is reordering everything. So, for example, this author field is probably not at the right place because it's all the way into the top. It would be probably better to have it right around the owner because it's kind of related. So what we can do in the placement editor is find the text fields placement, well, a box which is here, and drag it all the way down, just above the owner editor, and drop it here. So now what we should have is that the owner editor should be displayed just below the author editor. So let's save the content type. And on the right hand side, I will do a refresh. And if we go down, we see that yes, it actually worked. Well, not exactly as I've imagined, but it works. Well, probably I mistakenly put it above the data editor, but whatever. The outer text field is now at the bottom of the content type editor. So that's the basics of content items and content management in Orchard. You have to keep in mind that since Orchard is a CMS, content is in the center. Everything that's useful to have as a content item is a content item, and that means that they are all extensible, flexible. You can change them even from the admin. You can change them from code as well, we will see that. And you can do a lot of cool stuff just by clicking around on the admin. All of this is good because you are not bound to monolithic content models. Although these content types are built in, you can change them as you wish.